We've been talking about the angiosperms. Let's see, we've gone through um, quite a bit of the angiosperm slide set. In that information, we were looking at, zooming into the flower, of course, and looking at the ovary and the ovules inside, and looking at the so-called embryo sac or the megagametophyte development. Let me pull that one up. Where did it go? There it is. And so this version that I'm asking you to know is called the polygonum type. So that word's right there. The polygonum type embryo sac or megagametophyte development. And so that's the only one that I'm going to ask you in lecture to know. And so it's all laid out here where that functional megaspore. So remember that's happening. You can have that so-called megaspore mother cell that is formed in the megasporangium. And so instead of having lots of megaspores, packed into the megasporangium, there's just one. And then that one has to go through meiosis. Anytime you have one cell going through meiosis, you get 4 progeny or daughter cells. Then 3 of those die off, and you're just left with that one. And so that's the so-called functional megaspore, which is being shown here. And so now that has half the number of chromosomes. So we say it's haploid. And so you can see that one is surviving, the other ones are dying off. And then that functional megaspore goes through this 3 rounds of mitosis in order to form at the very end, when everything's good to go, you have 8 nuclei, but only 7 cells. And of course, one of those cells is the egg, which is super important, obviously, because we need to get the sperm and the egg to fuse to create the baby embryo, the baby sporophyte. Okay, are there questions on any of that process? Pretty straightforward. We looked at the pollen grains. We did that, realizing that we have lots of pollen getting produced and that you have a microspore mother cell, many of those, okay, so not just one like we saw with the megaspore, you got lots of microspores. They all go through meiosis, they all produce 4 progeny cells. Each one of those 4 progeny cells being produced can turn into a pollen grain. So when the pollen is getting shed from the flower or getting transferred, from during pollination, we say it's in the immature state because there's no sperm yet. You have a generative cell sitting in the pollen grain, and that will divide to produce the sperm, but it hasn't happened yet. Okay, and then you get the pollination event, which is getting the transfer of the pollen to the stigma. And you could have, in this image, they're showing 3 pollen grains. You can certainly have many pollen grains on one stigma. And you can see there, they're all germinating. Kind of the race, see who's going to win, which sperm is going to get delivered and make it to the egg. And then the other sperm, remember, goes to the polar nuclei in that one central cell. So you get the egg fertilized by one sperm, you get the sperm fusing with the central cell. And then that's going to develop into the endosperm. Okay, endosperm. So we've worked through that, and we looked at it kind of step by step. And here's kind of the grand picture showing both male and female processes going on in the flower. Okay, so we worked through that life cycle, the polygonum type life cycle, and I think we left off looking at this idea of coevolution. So thinking about this idea of why are angiosperms so successful here on Earth? And they're the largest group of plants by far. Why? One of the reasons is this idea of coevolution. During the this process of pollination, you usually have another organism involved in getting the pollen transferred to the stigma. And so this coevolution has been pointed to as a very successful strategy by the angiosperms to get very precise transfer of pollen to the stigma and allow for subsequent fruit formation. Right? If you look at it back in the progression of the evolutionary timeline, they think beetles were the first organisms to help out with pollination. And then eventually flying insects evolved, and they started to play a pretty big role in that as well. And so the plant, through this coevolution, you have some other organism like a beetle or a bee that is interacting with the flower, and they're both influencing each other's evolution, all right, through evolutionary time. And you can see one of the strategies that plants evolved was to produce certain nectars or odors in order to attract pollinators to come to the flower. And then the other idea too, don't forget that eventually, if everything goes okay, you're going to get a seed. In this case, it's fruit production. So then you need to get that dispersed out into a new habitat. So that's like part two. Part one is get pollination to happen. Hopefully everything goes okay. You end up with seeds in a fruit, and then you have to get the fruit dispersed. All right. And so they do point to this as a very strategic mechanism. Of course, it's through the process of evolution that we see this interaction between the pollinators. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that in the next slide set when I talk a little bit more about how pollination occurs with the help of these pollinators. A few other things though to say about the evolution of the angiosperms is that some other things that they point to say why angiosperms are so successful. Their leaves are pretty tough in the sense that many plants are well adapted to cold and drought. And the leaves also have very high concentrations of different chemicals to help defend themselves. And so the leaves are often a site of attack by, plant pathogens of some sort. And so they have a lot of chemical defenses as well, not just physical. The idea that vessels evolved. So remember with xylem, we have tracheids and vessels. And tracheids are skinny, vessels are wider in diameter. And they think that was a huge leap in evolutionary design to allow for more efficient movement of water through the plant. So they really think that's a big thing to think about for why they're so successful. And same with the sieve tube elements and the companion cells. They seem like just really well optimized for flow of sugar through the plant body. And so it seems like they've really evolved pretty efficient mechanisms. When you look at the seed and look at how it's very well designed to deal with adverse environmental conditions. It has a very tough seed coat, even though it's typically a pretty thin layer. It's really tough. So that helps the seed survive over years after tough times. Going deciduous, dropping your leaves. They actually think that's a good strategy and has really helped the angiosperms. Going dormant during tough times is one really good strategy of weathering the storm, so to speak. And so this idea of dropping leaves, before they drop the leaves, of course, they siphon away all the good stuff and send it down into their roots and their tree trunks or the stems for storage over winter. And then in the spring, they can remobilize those nutrients to the new growth that's occurring in the spring. And then we'll talk a little bit more about mechanisms for pollination and seed dispersal, and then of course the chemical defense. Primarily in leaf tissue, but really it can be found anywhere in the plant body. You're going to see plants are very well designed to ramp up different secondary metabolites as they're getting attacked. And so they don't always have all of these secondary metabolites up and running. It's in response to some attack by another organism. So I think we've talked a little bit about the idea with angiosperm. When you look at angiosperms, the two big classifications are they a monocot type angiosperm or a dicot? And so just a few more listings on that. When you look at dicots, when you look at their seeds and the cotyledons inside the seed, typically there's two. Okay, so they call those embryonic or seed leaves. That's another word for cotyledons. The flower parts, when you look at a flower from a dicot, they're typically in multiples of 4 or 5. So you'll see 4 petals, for example. It's easiest to count the petals typically, but you can see like 4 stamens, 4 pistils, things like that. And if you have to guess dicot, because 80% of all angiosperms are dicots. And so if someone's asking you, hey, is that a dicot or monocot? And you really don't know, and it's hard to tell, guess dicot. Many herbaceous species, but certainly not all, fall into the angiosperm. You look at their leaves, you'll see netted venation of the veins, that kind of pattern. And if you zoom into their pollen under the microscope, you'll see 3 openings or apertures for the fancy word. Okay, so those, I would like you to know those characteristics of a dicot or be able to recognize those. And comparing that to the monocot, it's usually pretty well defined in this group too. With the monocots, we tend to see 1 cotyledon inside the seed. Flower parts in multiples of 3, so 3 petals, 3 stamens, often. Herbaceous plants and non-woody trees fall into this category. So when we say non-woody, we just mean that it doesn't form true secondary xylem, like what we see like in oak trees or many, many different tree species. The veins will be parallel on the leaf and just 1 aperture or pore in the flower. So it's kind of nice that they kind of, they categorize out into these 2 big groups. So monocot on the left, dicot on the right. And then this is a visual of what we just went through. So this is kind of nice to study off of because it gives you the visual as well. Oh, and then the root system, that would be good to know as well. So typically the root system is a little messier. It's not so cut and dried, but it's a good rule of thumb to think about monocots mostly having more of a fibrous root system where all the roots look fairly the same size and diameter, but with dicots you tend to see more of a bigger taproot. Usually it's the central one that's growing straight down, and then you'll have more slender roots coming off. But again, root systems, there's a lot of variation there, so sometimes that can be really hard. And since we don't really see roots when we're looking at plants, it's easier to do the above ground. Vascular bundles, we already went through that with stem tissue. With monocots, they just have their vascular bundles all scattered through the whole stem. But with dicots, you tend to have a ring of vascular tissue. So that's a good thing to think about as well. This is another version. So whatever helps you get this straight in your head. And then I'm not really going to get into the anatomy of the flowers other than these, I guess, these 3 ideas are important. The idea of a perfect versus an imperfect flower, and then the inflorescence idea. So perfect, if it's a perfect flower, it just means that it has both male and female. Male is androecium, female is gynoecium. And so it will have everything in that one flower. Imperfect flowers, they're either a female flower, or it's just female parts, or it's a male flower with just male parts. And then inflorescence just means you have lots of little flowers grouped together in a cluster to make it look like maybe one big flower. Sunflowers are an excellent example of that. Sunflowers are really an inflorescence. I'll show you a close-up of that. But as far as inflorescences, there's all kinds. I mean, the patterns are kind of extensive, so we're not going to get into the details of that. But if you are out trying to identify plants, they often will use this terminology. They'll ask you to look for any of these patterns when you see the flower production. And so it's useful if you're going to try to identify plants. I'm just going to mention two families and a little bit about their flowers. So the largest families of angiosperms are the Orchidaceae family or the Asteraceae family. Those two are the biggest. And it's kind of strange living here in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. It's weird to think that orchids are the biggest family because we have very few orchids up here. And you don't see them except for certain times of the year, and that's it. And so it's a little weird to think that they're the largest family. With the Asteraceae, those are a little easier to see around here, but here, that family has flowers that have like two parts to it. There's a disc flower and ray flowers. And so the disc flowers are right in the center. And if you looked at it, you might not realize that those are a bunch of tiny flowers, but I'll show you. And then the ray flowers tend to be around the periphery of the flower. So we're describing here an inflorescence where you have lots of flowers all grouped together to make it look like you have one big flower. And it depends, like one inflorescence, so like a sunflower, you can have a mix of flowers, can be perfect or imperfect. It just depends on the species. Sunflowers are fun to grow because if you look at them, you'll see that the flower develops in a spiral fashion because there's many flowers all getting into maturity and they kind of stagger their timing. And so you'll see this spiraling fashion of the flower forming, and then same with the seed production. Like you'll start to see seeds popping up in this spiral pattern. So if you ever have the time to grow sunflowers in your garden or in a pot on your patio, they're fun to watch because of their kind of staggered development of the different flowers. So this is an inflorescence. When you look at it, you might say, oh, look at that sunflower, but it's really a ton of flowers all clustered together. So you have the central one in the middle, so lots of tiny flowers, and then the ray flowers on the side where you actually have the petal attaching to the ray flower. Well, they make dwarf sunflowers that if you don't have a lot of space in your garden, you can still grow them in a pot on your patio or your front door. They're fun to grow. Here's one that's been dissected where you can see how tightly clustered those central flowers are. Really quite cool design. So the Asteraceae family tend to have flower designs like this, where there are inflorescences. You have lots of tight clustering of smaller flowers like that. The orchids, the Orchidaceae family, they have unusual flowers as well. They're not inflorescences, but they have a really interesting design to their flowers. As I said, they don't really have, there's not very many species up here. We have terrestrial, like the ones that come up from the soil, not the ones that live on other trees. But lady slippers are probably the most common one up here. And really strange seed production. Their seeds are tiny, and I'm saying like the size of a dust speck tiny, which I still get. It's amazing to me that they're they're the biggest family, and they have seeds that are pretty pathetic when it comes. Like there's no nutrition in the seed. There's nothing for the baby to take nutrients from. And so they absolutely rely on a mycorrhizal fungus in order to get that seed to germinate. And they rely on the fungus for the baby embryo to germinate and grow and actually be able to survive. When you look at their flower, they have this column, the central column part typically, that has the stamen that's actually fused to the female part, to the style and stigma. So it's all fused together. They're not separate. And then you tend to see 3 petals. And then in addition to that, there'll be 2 wings. And all together, they all might look very similar to each other. So you might think, oh, there's 5 petals, but technically it's 3 petals and then 2 wings. And then you'll have a cup structure portion. I'll show you some pictures here. And so, and then you'll see 3 sepals that often are colored the same as the petals. And so taken together, it's a very interesting design. We say that they have bilateral symmetry, which is an indication that they're more advanced on an evolution timescale. We call them more evolutionarily advanced if you have bilateral symmetry. Like we have bilateral symmetry. There's only the way to tell if you're bilateral symmetrical is if you pretend to cut that organism in half. And if there's only one way, like there's only one way to cut yourself in half, so you get 2 mirror images of yourself. You know, that would be straight down the middle. And orchid flowers are like that too. Whereas like the Asteraceae, no matter which way you cut them, you'll get mirror images of the cut pieces. So then that's called radial symmetry versus bilateral. So we're bilateral, orchid flowers are bilateral. So some of these plants are what we call saprophytic, which means they really don't do enough. Either they don't do photosynthesis or they don't do enough photosynthesis and they need help to get nutrients from it's usually a mycorrhizal fungus. And they will like take nutrients from another organism nearby. But most do photosynthesis. So the basic idea of the flower here, you see that there is the 2 petals and then the lip in the front that's modified. And then you have the 3 sepals behind the petals or below the petals when you look down on the flower. And so the lip is usually designed in such a way for the pollinator that is specific for that species to come and pollinate. Now, humans have intervened in orchid production and flower design. So I'm going to show you some pictures here that are pretty bizarre. So through human intervention, you can see some pretty wacky looking flowers. So they call this top left one the duck orchid. Doesn't that look like 2 ducks in flight? Isn't that bizarre? This top middle one is the vampire. I think they call it the vampire orchid. Looks like a vampire with fangs. And then here that looks like doves sitting in with the background of the petals behind it. So they call it the dove orchid. Monkey face orchid. Down low and left there in the middle bottom, I think that's egret. White egret orchid. And this one on the far right, they just call it naked man. Naked man orchid. So very bizarre looking flowers. And so obviously, I mean, like, you know, the duck orchid isn't doing that to attract ducks to come and pollinate it. That's not really what's going on. It's human intervention that has created very specific looking flowers. But having said that, there are natural flowers, you know, just through the evolutionary process of the orchid species with its pollinator, where you have some very interesting adaptations going on and ways that the orchids they actually say they trick their pollinators. I'll mention a couple of ideas on that. Here's some more orchid flowers. You can see how ornate the flowers can be. The one on the left here is called a chocolate orchid. There's one in the greenhouse that just bloomed. And during the day, it actually gives off the smell of chocolate. It smells like chocolate. It's wonderful. It's actually my orchid. I had it in my house, but my house doesn't provide enough humidity and it got really, really sad, so I donated it to the greenhouse. But when it's in bloom in the day, it gives off chocolate scent, and it's very strong. And then at night, it'll stop producing the scent. The one on the right here is Phalaenopsis. Those are the ones that you see commonly for sale because they're pretty tough. It's hard to kill them. And so those are the ones that get sold for people who don't have a lot of training in how to care for plants. But you can see the chocolate orchid can get quite big, and it has a beautiful spray of flowers. But you can see all kinds of different colors, sizes, patterns. It's really stunning. So people who get caught up into the orchid world, I mean, fanatics is a good term for some people. I mean, they're just absolutely fanatic about orchids, and people have killed each other over orchids. And they used to hunt orchids back in the Victorian era. They would, rich people would go hire people to go find me some orchids, and people would travel the world, go look for orchids. And there's stories of people murdering each other because, one orchid hunter found this rare orchid and another hunter got wind of it. And so he went, killed that person and grabbed the orchid. Just crazy stuff, so it is like, it's a kind of an obsession with some people, and very, very interesting. There's an orchid, big orchid, I don't know what they call it. It's not really a conference, but it's like this huge orchid show every spring, around spring break time in Chicago. I think that's the closest one that I'm aware of. I don't know if there's anything in Wisconsin, but the one in Chicago is kind of famous. It's just like football field size buildings of orchids as far as you can see. So if you are in that area, you might want to try going to one. Just leave your credit card at home. I'd have to go with cash and just stick to that because boy, it'd be so easy to overspend. Okay, so let me get a little bit more into pollination. So thinking about this idea of, we have to, we've talked about how the embryo sac develops in the megagametophyte, the microgametophyte, getting pollination happens. But that's not the end of the story. From our perspective, from the human perspective, we're very interested in like phase 2 of this whole process, which is to actually get the fruit so that we can do that food production. Well, so it really does depend on how that plant gets pollinated, how the flower will look, and how the fruit will end up looking as well. And so when you think about pollination, the transfer of pollen from the anther to the stigma, there's a few ways that this can happen in kind of a big picture idea. It could just be wind. And so if that plant is wind pollinated, so if you were a plant that was depending on wind for pollination, would you put time and energy and resources into a big fancy flower? No, that doesn't make sense because you're not trying to attract a pollinator, you're just letting wind do it. So wind pollinated flowers usually sometimes people don't even know it's a flower when they look at it. They're like, that's a flower? And so I'll show you some pictures. I think I have some pictures in here. Same with water. Water, you don't really go fancy. The only thing really with water, you have maybe ways to be buoyant. So you might have like air pockets as part of the flower, or I've seen some cool flower designs where it's flowers that are on the surface of the water. They'll actually have some of their flower parts that act like a sail on a sailboat that will be cupped and catch the wind so it can actually, and then the whole flower like breaks free and skims across the surface of the water. So there's some really cool designs with water. But again, nothing too fancy. It's just the physics of trying to take advantage of where they are in the water or on the water. gravity. Of course, pollination can occur technically through gravity in many cases. But really what we're zooming in here, what's fun to think about is the pollinator idea, where you have a particular organism you're trying to attract. And so now we're thinking about that coevolution idea, where you have a very particular pollinator for that particular plant. And we have to appreciate that the way we see the world can be different from other organisms. So I'll show you some pictures of how certain pollinators might look at a flower and what they might see compared to what our eyes are capable of visualizing. And so that can play a role as well into when you look at the flower, we see a certain color, but we have to appreciate that their pollinator might see a very different design and color. Most of the time with this idea of the pollination being due to another organism, it's usually a win-win situation where the pollinator gets a payoff for delivering pollen to the stigma. Then the pollinator usually gets a reward, whether it be some extra pollen that they can have or nectar, but not always. Orchids are famous for tricking, so to speak, from tricking their pollinators into getting the plant pollinated, and the pollinator gets nothing in return. And I'll mention a few examples. 84% of commercial crops depend on pollinators. So lots of interest in how this happens. Commercial crops is mostly honeybees. When you add it all up, honeybees are the most important in terms of sheer numbers of the different crops. Okay, couple of things to think about when you are looking at pollination. It matters if you're perfect or imperfect in the flower design. So imperfect, remember that means it's just a male flower or it's a female flower, not both. Now, a couple of terms I'd like you to think about. So if you have imperfect flowers, you have a couple of situations that could happen. You might put both of those flowers on the same plant, where you have a male flower and a female flower on the same plant. Then we would say that that plant is monoecious. Monoecious. And so if it has a male and female on the same plant, that means you could get pollen from the male flower to the female flower because they're right there on the same plant. So that means they're self-pollinating. Or the female flower could get pollen from a nearby plant that has male flowers nearby. And so there's some options there. If you have a dioecious situation, what that means is for that plant species, you have a male version of that plant species that has male flowers, and then you have a separate female individual of that species with just the female flowers. All right, so dioecious means two houses. So that means one plant gets to be male, the other individual of that species will be the female version. If that's the case, then they can't technically self-pollinate because they're just one sex or the other. And so they can only cross-pollinate. They have to get pollen, the female plant has to get pollen from a male plant. So those terms cross-pollination and self-pollination, we tend to use those words. In animals, we tend to say outbreeding, inbreeding, but in the botany world, we tend to say cross-pollination, self-pollination. Okay, so it does make a difference if it's a species that has perfect or imperfect. So if you're a perfect flower, you could certainly self-pollinate, but some perfect flowers won't self-pollinate. Like it doesn't work. And so they're trying to still figure that out. And so here's an example of a very distinct male and female. So you can see the male flower is off on the right. You can see all the anthers here, lots and lots of pollen, but no female parts. And then on the left, this is all female. Okay, so it's a really nice visual of an imperfect situation. Here it's monoecious, it's on the same plant. Corn is another really good example of monoecious, imperfect flowers on the same plant. So we have the male tassel on the very top of the corn plant, and then the female flowers actually where the corn on the cob will get formed. All right, so the silk, we often refer to the corn when you shuck the corn husk in the silk that you take off and the tough leaves around it. The silk is actually the style. So the stigma is at the very tip, and then the style, it's all style material. And so the sperm has to go all the way down that silk. And then if you were to carefully dissect the corn, you'd see that each silk attaches at one unique spot on the flower, and that's where the ovary is. So when you bite into corn on the cob, each kernel of corn is really a fruit. Isn't that weird? It's weird because you're so used to thinking of corn on the cob as a vegetable, but each kernel is a fruit. Kind of fun to think about. Here is a dioecious example where you have the female on one plant and then the male flowers on a separate individual of that species. Okay, dioecious, two houses. Male flowers, female flowers on different individuals. Okay, so now if you're thinking about having an organism involved in pollination, generally it's believed that you want to get pollen from another individual of the same species rather than just self-pollinating all the time, because that's kind of like inbreeding, where you don't get enough genetic mixing going on, and it tends to lead to problems with the offspring. And so generally it's believed that it's a better idea to get pollen from outside sources to those flowers so you get better mixing of the genes during sexual reproduction. So one way to do that would be to have this dioecious idea where you have pollen coming from a different individual over to the female plant. And so a dioecious plant could do that for promoting cross-pollination. Even if it's a perfect flower though, you can have a situation where the pollen and the ovary don't mature at the same time. And so the pollen might be ready to go long before the ovary and the egg inside and the ovules is ready to happen. And so they often say that the stigma is not receptive. And so they're just out of step with each other with their maturation. And so they've done these experiments where they'll put pollen grains on the stigma and nothing happens. And so when they started looking more carefully at that, they realized that the timing is off in the terms of maturation. Sometimes it's a physical thing where the stigma is closed up and not accessible to the pollen until all the pollen is gone from that flower. So you have a perfect flower with pollen, and you would think it would just be easy for the pollen to get to the stigma, but the stigma is actually closed over and protected so that the pollen doesn't land on this open stigma. I'll show you a picture of that. And then there's this vague term that they call self-incompatibility. It's kind of an umbrella term, or we don't know quite what's going on here, but for some reason, we just can't get successful germination of the pollen grain, can't get anything to happen, even though the pollen might land on the stigma. And so they think it's a chemical incompatibility between the stigma and the pollen. And they're still trying to figure that out. So the generally thought cross-pollination is a good thing because you get a mixing up of the genes, more diverse genes in the offspring. So here's an example of a perfect flower, cluster of perfect flowers. And you can see on this left flower, that stigma is all closed up. It's like all piston, so to speak. And then on the right, so then the pollen grains shed, and then after the pollen grains shed, you can see on the right here, this flower, all the pollen grains have shed out already. Then the stigma opens up and is ready to be pollinated from pollen coming from a different flower, right? So that's one really good strategy. So those types of ideas to think about, with regard to perfect, imperfect flowers, how do they strategize and do this? So if, let's think about a plant that wants to be cross-pollinated, so to speak. So if you're trying to get a pollinator to come visit, then you better evolve to attract that pollinator. And so this idea of think like a marketing person or an advertising person, where it really does pay to act. You want to catch the attention of the pollinator. And so it really depends on the pollinator, how you're going to do that, right? So we're thinking about this coevolution process going on. And so if you're trying to get a pollinator's attention, and if they're visual like we are, then you probably want a lot of flowers. You want to be bright and showy, flashy, so you get the attention of an organism that's visual like we are. You want to stand out from the background. So the background of the plant is usually lots of green leaves. So that's why flowers typically are green. You want to be in contrast to all the leaves around you. So you tend to stick up off away from the leaves, and you tend to have big bright colors. Scent does depend. It depends on the pollinator. Some pollinators really don't seem to have a sense of smell, and others do. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. So question mark on that, it depends. And then number of pollen grains. So in general, if you compare flowers that have a pollinator versus like wind pollination, usually a pollinating flower will have less pollen. They don't have to make as much pollen in order for success. If wind is so imprecise that you make a ton of pollen in the vague hope that you can get some pollen grains over to the female flowers and stigma. But when you have pollinators doing the job for you, that's much more precise. And so they tend not to make as much pollen. Visually, you have to appreciate that our sight, our sense of vision is not always the same as other organisms. So here, what you're seeing is a difference between what we see and what like bumblebees or honeybees would see. And so on the left is what we see when we look at this flower, and on the right is under ultraviolet light, because bees can perceive ultraviolet light. And so you can see a huge difference in the pattern and color. And it's almost like the flower has like, that central dark area and then those lines. So it's almost like a target, like come to the center of the flower here, come here. And so it's often that you'll get that kind of pattern that's very obvious under ultraviolet. And so the bees, or the pollinator, they're trying to get to, if you come here, this is where the payoff is. But in the process, they'll help pollinate the flower. That's because they'll have either pollen on their face or body part. Again, ultraviolet versus visible. We see what's on the right, but a bee perhaps would see what you see on the left. So really interesting differences. We get so comfortable thinking about everyone must see the way we see and hear the way we hear, and it's just not that way. Very, very different. So we see what's up on the left, all yellow, and that's not what it looks like from a bee's perspective. Again, we see all the yellow and they don't. They see a very different look. So really fun to think about how bees perceive the world so differently than we do when it comes to flower design. And incredibly important, they don't seem to perceive bright red in the same way we do. And when we see a blue or yellow flower, those are the flowers that they seem to be more attracted to. And often you'll see a flower that has some kind of landing platform, because bees are kind of heavy and flowers can be delicate. So they usually beef up a little bit of the flower so that they can have the bee land. And apparently bees can smell. So often flowers that are pollinated by bees, we would detect usually a pleasant smell. When you sniff the flower, it would have a pleasant smell to it. So honeybees are incredibly important for commercial crop production. About a third of the human nutrition is due to bee pollination. So you probably have heard of colony collapse disorder, right? I hope. It's something that's still of concern. And so here are some good examples of flowers that can handle the weight of the bee, bright yellow to our eye. And then even something like this, some flowers will have the bee like put their legs down into the flower a little bit to get access to some nectar. And so sometimes you'll see a little bit of a trumpet shape like that. Here's a really good example of a landing platform where they will land there and they crawl in. And as they're moving around and crawling around, they help pollinate the stigma. And we'll stop there. That's a beautiful image of the honeybee with some pollen on it. Okay, we'll pick this up on Monday and get more into commercial crop production next week.